Okay, welcome to the 43rd lecture of the Otaru University of Commerce English Lecture Series. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Ted Weeks from the Department of History at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale in America. The topic of his talk today is Purpose, Politics, and Practice of Teaching History in the United States. Please welcome Professor Weeks.
Minasan, konnichiwa. That's about the extent of my Nihongo. But I was very interested when Professor Clanky mentioned the series of coming to Otaru and talking about anything I wanted. I'm actually, my specialty is the history of Eastern Europe, especially Russia, the Russian Empire mainly, and now I'm at the Surabu Kenkyu Center in Sapporo for 5 months, and I'm working on a book. I'm writing a book. I've been researching it for longer than I want to say, on the capital of what's now the capital of Lithuania, Vilnius. It's a very interesting multi-ethnic city. I'm very interested in ethnicity. Now, I thought just as a visual aid, which American teachers are very big on, I would bring in this book, which I'm actually going to give to this august institution so they can have it. We will soon be going into our second edition, although unfortunately we're not making any money yet. So we hope that the second edition will fill our pocket with thousands and millions of yen. That hasn't happened. But I think it might be interesting to you. I know from Europe that the way we teach history and from Israel, places I'm familiar with, at the university level is totally different. And this book, which is a textbook aimed at first-year university students, is a good example, I think. I'm one of 5 authors. That's pretty typical. I just noticed, I hadn't even thought of this, there's a section on Meiji restoration that I wrote. So I noticed that it put a little tag in here. I'll send that around. This is an example of a Western CEiv textbook, but a quite new one, only its first edition here. And let me just go over the outline quickly that I made. There are extra copies if anyone needs them. Yeah, all right. Couple here, and I think I saw a hand over here. Pass this back. Someone wanted one here, I think. Well, I'll put it here. If anyone needs it, they can use it. So I'd like to start by talking about sort of theoretically, generally, why study history. And you can come up with your own ideas. I'd be very interested to know how history is taught in your countries and in Japan. I know that at the university level, it's completely different institutionally than the way we teach it. I know that that in Hokudai, we asked, because I'm at the Slavic Research Center, so I said, well, who teaches Russian history? This often happens in Japan for us. It would be the same way, I'm sure, with you if you're studying in Finland or in Israel or in the United States. It seems to me a very easy question. If you ask that at Harvard or Stanford or Southern Illinois, who teaches Russian history? They will say, this person, that person. That's not so easy here, because the institution is different. You don't have history departments, per se, that teaches this in the way that we do. They ended up explaining to us, well, some people who do Russian literature also teach history classes at the university. So, in other words, it just shows that we are approaching this in a different way. So, first of all, just sort of generally. Second of all, a little more specifically about the US and how history is taught at school. That I'm trying to remember, and I have, it's been a while since I've been at school, but I'll do as best as I can through, since I don't have children, I have to think of sort of my talking to the teenage kids of my friends, but I have it, at least I think I'm right in general. University, that I do know, because I'm doing it myself, teaching at that level. And then finally, I'd like to end by talking about Western CEiv, and CEiv short for civilization. It's a more traditional course. Our book, although we don't think of ourselves as traditionalists, any of the authors there, but still, and world history, and what each of these two approaches, which are both very general, very big kind of histories, are trying to do. All right, and I will try to only talk, I'll set my timer, I'll give myself about 35 or arigatou gozaimasu, or 40 minutes, so that you can talk. Because I'd like to hear your comments, questions. If I'm speaking too fast, you can say, "Mo ichido ite kudasai." That much I understand. I don't usually understand what people then say to me, but in any case, I hope that this will be useful and interesting for both of us. So, as I said myself, what I do research on is Eastern Europe, Jewish history, the way the Russian Empire treated different non-Russian nationalities. So pretty different from Japanese history. The only parallel, there are some parallels with Ainu, but that's actually not the kind of work I do, because I work with Poles and not like Siberia or Sakhalin, Karafuto, that's the kind of thing I do. There are some parallels in Japanese history with Korea and Koreans within Japan, but it's a pretty different thing. It's also quite different. It's difficult for Americans, because Americans don't think of different nationalities living together but retaining their cultures, until very recently anyway. We think of, all of my mother's parents were both born in Europe. You come to the United States and you become American, it's no big deal. So whether you're from Japan originally, or from Africa originally, or from wherever, I don't know about New Zealand, that's straight, but Finland even, the Communist Party in the United States was dominated by Finns. Not too many people know that, but Finns are liked anyway. So you come in after a couple generations, or really one generation very often. My mother doesn't speak any languages other than English. You become American. So it's interesting now, I think, for American students to look at a place like the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, which is quite similar if you make these big comparisons with a place like, say, India, multi-ethnic, because now the United States is going towards, at least ideally, a more multicultural idea of preserving these different ethnicities, at least culturally. All right, so I'm not going to go off on too many tangents. So I just actually sat down at the computer and wrote down these 6 history and its uses. One use, all of these are not mine, memorializing the past. That is to say, what dates do we remember? Dates, events, people, and how do we remember them? 4 years ago, I was teaching in Poland for the year at the University of Warsaw, and I started a course, really great students, with just I gave them a bunch of dates that were really Polish history. And they had to say which ones they knew, which ones they didn't know. That is their Polish history in the way that I would teach Polish history. But some of them they knew perfectly. History in Poland is taught very, how to put it, aggressively, I'd say, at the high school level. And some of them they didn't know at all. Because, in particular, things like Jewish history within Poland, they hardly knew at all. So this kind of thing, what do we memorialize? So do we memorialize Tsushima? Do we memorialize Hideyoshi? Do we memorialize Hiroshima? This kind of thing is, that's one use of history. Another use of history, which comes in different ways, is sort of defining yourself as a member of the nation. And again, so if you're French, of course, you think Robespierre is great, and may the furrows overflow with impure blood. That's a joke, actually. The national anthem. But in any case, if you're French, you may not like Robespierre, but you don't say, who? Whereas if you're Japanese or American, my students, they should know, I would hope, at the end of the semester, but they don't always know. The same kind of thing if you're an American, Abraham Lincoln, if you're from Illinois, it says it on our license plates, you know, the cars, Land of Lincoln, because that's where he's from. Again, this is in Eastern Europe extremely important. Sort of how we see ourselves in the past in the context of the larger community, Europe, the world, Asia, etc. Now, I've been trying to learn a little Japanese history while here, and here a good example of Japanese history is, I think, the Imperial Rescript on Education of 1890. I don't know if you'll recognize my pronunciation, but it's Kyoiku ni kansuru chokugo. In that rescript, it's really set down. This is what we're teaching. We want the Japanese kids to know these different things and to have reverence to the emperor and to traditions, etc. History plays a very big part in that kind of conservative part of education. It's one use, again, of history. Political legitimacy could also be one. Again, I just put them down. These aren't mine. These aren't just one person, but they're different ways of using history. So, for example, political legitimacy, that educational rescript is exactly that kind of thing. We want children going through school to feel respect for the existing order. When I first went to Moscow and Leningrad and Warsaw and Budapest, etc., it was all still under communism, and the way that history was taught then was, again, how great Lenin was and the liberation of the working class, and again, something that works together with political legitimacy at that time. Now that's changed, but not entirely. If you look, for example, at Russian education now, Russian education is a great example that the working class is out. They don't say great things about Lenin particularly, but Russia and the fact that the Soviet power strengthened Russia, the Russian nation, that's definitely part of history that's being taught. It's controversial, people are arguing about it, but it is one use of history. Another use, down to D now, putting the present into perspective. So how do we understand what's going on at the present time by putting in a larger perspective? So this could be in a very specific political way. So our political system works in a certain way. When it has had crises, maybe it should be changed. How do other political systems work? It could be actually quite personal, because history also is cultural history, it's social history, it's not just politics. So it could be a number of these things. But for me, this is probably one of the most important things in teaching history, is to try to help my students get a broader perspective. That's something we're really trying to do in that book. Whether we really do or not, that's another question. Finally, two more of theory. Critical thinking. Now, critical thinking is part of progressive education since probably the Enlightenment. Everything goes back to France, of course. Or Locke. It could also be the Les Rospif, the Englishman as well. Progressive education, including in the US, in theory anyway, what you want to do is to take a child and help that child be able to think, to be independent, to fit into society, yes, but to also examine the situation in a logical way and say yes or no, I agree, I don't agree, whether according to thought out, reasonable ideas. If you've been following the United States election campaign, which I hope you haven't, it's incredibly depressing, you will wonder what happened to all that progressive education, you know, all these people that went to very good schools. But that's another question. If you want to talk about American politics, I can also do that, but I don't want to. Finally, learning from the past. That's what, if you ask people, often ask students, you have a class, to start them, why are you taking this class? And of course, if they're honest, they're saying, I have to, I don't have any choice. But even so, what do you want to get out of it? We don't want to make the errors of the past. No historian basically would say that, I think, because I think we're more modest than that. And we recognize that even if you know a lot of history, you still make lots of mistakes, in particular because 2012 is not 1945. So the lessons that we get from 30 years ago, you can apply, but it's not directly. And so, however, we would probably say, we hope that it'll help to equip you to be more sophisticated in dealing with the world, in dealing, if you are, this is a school of commerce, if you're dealing with a business situation, with things that have happened in the past, why it worked, why it didn't work, as a citizen, etc. All right, so enough theory. Students usually, I don't know about Japanese students, I hope to come back here and find out more, but American students hate theory. Whenever you're trying to get, here is the main point when you teach big history classes, we have to talk about sociology. But when you start talking about Peter the Great slaughtering thousands of people, they all perk up and get very happy again. So I won't draw any conclusions about sort of human characteristics from that. But in any case, a little bit more concrete. I'm afraid we won't have any mass murderers here. But if you want me to talk about Stalin, I'm quite capable at a moment's notice of doing that too. So in the US, we also, of course, have history of different sorts at school. So I actually have a good little friend, the son of a friend of mine in 3rd or 4th grade. I should have asked him what he is learning presently in Baltimore in 4th grade about history, what kind of things they're doing. I know better for high school, so that in the United States would be 9th through 12th grade. Basically, the way that history is taught is through social studies. That's what I put on your list here. Normally, we don't have specific classes that are just called history. We have these classes called social studies. What is the purpose of that? The idea was, and again, this is not new. When I was in junior high school, 7th grade, which has been 4 years nearly, it was already social studies. The idea is that you're not going to be able to have economics, sociology, psychology, et cetera, specifically. So you integrate it all into history. The theory is good. The practice is sometimes a bit more shaky, questionable, problematic. ask Americans, if you look at some American kid in 10th grade at his classes, her classes, you probably won't see history. You might, but you'll very likely see social studies, this, that, and that. That's even more the case at lower grades, at 6th grade or 7th grade, before they're in high school. All right, when they do, so social studies, when they do have history, it tends to be overwhelmingly American history. And that's, I think, in most countries, that's going to be the case, because after all, going back to the why do you teach history, one of the reasons is teaching the kids what they are. What does it mean to be a Finn? Obviously it means to eat. Silly, to, I don't know, what else does it mean? To jump over bonfires in the middle of the summer, to get drunk a lot. Russians think that. We say to Russians, you are saying other people get drunk a lot? But in any case, you don't teach them certain of those things you don't need to teach, but other things, Kalevala, what sort of thing? Give me 2 examples of things that a Finnish child would definitely learn, say, a 12-year-old about history.
Well, I think they always tell about the Winter War and the Continental War.
Yeah, the Winter War, so part of the Great Pacific War, World War II in Finland.
And also the independence, like in the 1970s.
All right, so again, you see, that is exactly the kind of thing, because, where's Finland? I'm a Finn, I speak Finnish. What does that mean? Well, we got independence after World War I, and then the nasty Russians came in and tried to, it was a pretty nasty war in World War II, and tried to take our independence away, etc. So you see that this kind of thing would be, for Americans, definitely the Civil War. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, that is very key. And it would be taught in extremely different ways if you're in Minnesota or if you're in Mississippi. I don't know if you know the geography of the United States, but Mississippi was part of the Confederacy, which seceded, that is, broke away from the United States in 1861. So there, I have a feeling you would get a different point of view. But in any case, you definitely, students love. With me, they don't know what to do because they don't know much about Russia or Poland, or even that they exist. But the Civil War, and of course the Revolutionary War, but that's a bit farther away. Revolutionary War, of course, would be equivalent in a way to getting independence in 1917 for Finland. But since it happens in the 18th century, but still you would, it's a little bit farther away, but definitely kids would learn things about George Washington, they would learn things about the first flag, this kind of thing. So I would be interested to know what kind of things Japanese children learn, and if they're told that this emphasizes the Meiji a lot, if this emphasizes Hideyoshi, if they go all the way back to the Heian period, and what exactly, I'm sure they do, but what exactly they say about this. These kind of things are very, very interesting from kind of to see what is being taught, and what kind of identity is being given to the kids. Also New Zealand, very interesting with Maoris and this kind of thing, and sheep, and whatever. But anyway, so each country, I think probably most of us, when you get to the university, are skeptical of the way things are taught in 8th grade. But at the same time, we have internalized a lot of those things. That's why it's good to go out of your country and study elsewhere, because you realize, oh, I never really thought of that this way. As a Japanese person, if you went and talked to your Korean friends about the 20th century, you know, you'd find some different interpretations, some of which you expect and probably some of which are surprising. So Mexicans and United States Americans, very different interpretations, in particular the 19th century. All right, so finally, so American history is very much emphasized. The rest of the world it tends to be kind of out there. Part of the problem is, of course, that most teachers don't have that much experience outside the US. They usually don't speak other languages. That's changing somewhat. It's also that school boards, the way that teachers are allowed to teach, and in the United States there isn't a Ministry of Education that dictates this. It's each little area of the town I live in, there's a specific school board. This is something I think is unique. It's certainly now in Israel, in Poland, I believe in Finland, in France. France is the best example. France is the model, actually, of the centralization that at 924 throughout France, and in fact in Vietnam and in Senegal, this is in 1890, every student is on the same page. This is not the case in the United States, which is both bad and good. We can come back to that if you're interested. So going to the university. Again, American history is dominant. Just give my department, about 20 professors, half of them do American history. One of the trends in university teaching in the US of history is to try to be more comparative. So some of them, one of my colleagues does African diaspora. So that is Africa and Georgia, so the Atlantic world, to do it that way. But he's more of an Americanist than an Africanist. But most of the Americanists are really Americanist. And they would be hard-pressed to have a conversation with you, even in bad Finnish or bad French, not to mention bad Japanese. So what about the other half? I'm just talking now about broad courses that are usually in your first couple of years, your first year or two at the university. So I mentioned here Western Civ and World, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail here. These are courses that 30 years ago or 50 years ago, basically every student would be taking. 50 years ago, it would have been Western Civ. When I started the undergraduate, I was in a huge class, 300 students of Western Civ at University of Colorado, and that was and now that's changing. There are more choices, but still, I teach a course in world history that has 300 students in it, and again, it's one of the broad requirements, the so-called breadth requirements. So, what is Western Civ? What is world? Western Civ is a very unique phenomenon. I think it's uniquely American, at least when I talk to my Israeli or European colleagues. They find it really crazy that I'm teaching at a university these kind of broad things that basically cover. Western Civ, you start with Adam and Eve. You start with early peoples. You start with Mesopotamia, really. So it isn't entirely Europe. But then Egypt, Greece, Rome, Christianity, Renaissance, Reformation, blah, blah, blah. In any case, it is quite, it is centered on Europe, and that's not by chance. The idea when Western Civ was really became almost universal, which was really right after World War II. So in the 1940s, existed some before that, but the idea was we want, again, we're teaching people identity. We want young Americans who are at university to have a feeling of continuity between themselves and these great ideas of the Enlightenment, of Greece, of Rome, of Christianity, and since this is the US, it's not just Christianity, Judeo-Christian ethic. So this is very important, these to not sort of tease out, not take out Christianity from the larger context of monotheism, the Jews, and then the Christians. So it was very much, ask you about New Zealand. Anything like this? How great the British Empire was and how unhappy we are that it kind of collapsed?
Well, they kind of, the British didn't really take over New Zealand. They signed like a peace treaty, so the Maoris in New Zealand and English kind of had mutual rights. So it wasn't like a colony.
Mm-hmm.
It was just mutual, supposed to be mutual, and it was only really recent in 1840. So there's not that much history like compared to Europe and America and Asia, and they go back hundreds and thousands of years.
But of course, the U.S. most of 1840 is very old for most parts of like the state of Illinois. You know, people were living in holes in the ground in 1840. I think most of them. But what's interesting is how, you know, we're teaching in 1945 these 18-year-old Americans about ancient Greece as their civilization. So I don't know, maybe not so directly.
I don't know. Well, at high schools in New Zealand, it's not compulsory to take history, and you don't really. We have social studies. I know.
You have social studies too. See, all the bad things from the United States, like all the bad things from Sweden go to Finland, and all the bad things from the United States go.
We had social studies, but we only really learned like very basic things. So I personally didn't take very much in the way of history growing up.
That's all right. You'll probably still have a happy life.
I think so.
It's interesting. It's also interesting, you know, the difference between sort of when I talk to my own students, like a few years later, sort of what they learn and what I was teaching. So that's another story of teachers and sort of theory and practice as well. All right, so I'd be very interested to look at sort of teaching curricula, in particular a while ago, like in the 40s or 50s in Australia and New Zealand. I have a feeling that there would be a lot of connection with our, you know, the homeland, i.e. England, rather than, this kind of, so in that sense maybe. But in any case, this is Western Civ. Now, lately it's been criticized, there's some some of this is correct, it's too much Europe, business is important, and I will come back to that because there are also counter arguments to this. But I'll just go on because you have the book, you can look at that and notice Meiji Japan is in there. I hope I was like reading it through going, did I make any really awful errors in this thing? Because the second edition is already in press, so I can't change them. I'd have to wait till the third. So, world history. It's kind of obvious why world history is attractive, because the United States, or at least some people in the United States, you don't realize it, but some people in the United States realize that we don't rule the world. Not Mr. Bush and some others, but realize that the United States is part of the world. It's not something separate. And that may seem very, like I'm just joking. I'm not joking. I mean, the United States is really a very separate kind of place. And when you teach students like I do in the middle of the country, it's not easy to convince them why they should know anything about the world. This is not the case in Finland. Or in Israel, or in Lithuania. They know why they have to know about the world. It's their survival. I mean, it's their job too. But unfortunately, 18-year-old Americans don't realize it's their job too. Because you guys are going to get their jobs. Because you speak Japanese and English and French, etc. And that's why they have to learn Chinese to start with. I'm always telling everyone, no offense. Also Japanese, but there are more Chinese. In any case, this is part of it. That educators realize we have to help our students fit into the world. And world history does this. Now, I teach world history. I teach Western Civ. I've written, maybe someday I'll also write, I hope I'll write a world history textbook because you make more money that way. At least you've got to make more money than we have made so far. We can also talk about economics of these things if you're interested. And so I think I know a bit about weaknesses and strengths of both. One of the big problems with world history is simply it's huge. You have 2 semesters. The first semester goes from amoebas, little animals, to approximately 1500. And that 1500 is also very Eurocentric, or at least very Atlantic-centric, because it's right after Columbus discovers, whatever word you want, America. I don't teach the first half yet. I think I'll have to sooner or later, but I teach the second half, which is hard enough, 1500 to the present day. I have 27 lectures, basically, in a semester, because there are exams, other things. So 27 times, 45 minutes, I have to teach 18-year-old Americans who know nothing about the world, pretty much, and try to give them something. So, well, I'll just give you an example of, I wish I had my lecture here, of the Meiji Restoration. Meiji Restoration, we get Tokugawa shogunate, 5 minutes maybe. We've got Ieyasu there, sitting in a great picture of him. We get sort of warlords. Then, a couple weeks later, we get Meiji, we get Shubatsu, we get pictures of the emperor the first, that is Meiji, in a railroad, in the first railroad to Yokohama, and we get World War II, Hiroshima, end of story. This is all in like 15 minutes. And it's because I've got to also talk about Africa, I've got to talk about colonization, I've got to talk about the Enlightenment. So it's problematic. I would say it's not, it also is, for some students, it's a revelation. It's something really interesting. It's really new. They haven't heard these things. And for that reason, it's actually kind of fun to teach, because students will come up and say, and these are usually students who aren't studying history, they're not going to become history teachers. They're studying chemistry or business, and they're just taking this because you have to. That's, sorry, I think I skipped over Roman numeral 3, D, history majors. History majors would be people who are concentrating. Their main studies are history. And core curriculum, that's sort of everyone else. Half of your classes at the university in the United States are in core curriculum. So that's very different, at least from what I know, of at least European and Israeli universities, because most of that kind of core curriculum stuff in Europe you get at high school, in the lycée or in the gymnasium or whatever. That may be changing there. All right, so a couple, just a bit more, and very quickly, because I'd like to talk too long. This is what happens to professors. Western Civ versus world history. You can also argue that Western Civ, you also have to, you have a lot of stuff to cover, and it is also not very sophisticated. It's just a matter of degree. I mean, I also talk about the Enlightenment in 45 minutes, which is insane when you think about it. But at least I don't have to talk about the Enlightenment and the Reformation and the Huguenots and Louis XIV in 45 minutes. That's the kind of difference teaching the two of them. In any case, if you look at our textbook, you'll find that Western Civ, and that's a Western Civ textbook, especially, I don't know if I can really say that, I think especially in the more modern period, but actually I'd say in general, because the earlier period actually is less European because it started, it has more African and Mesopotamian, etc. But certainly, even in my period with imperialism, with me being a Russianist, not a Western Europeanist as a specialist, it's very much affected by, we want to teach our students about the world, but concentrating on this European context, which then became the North American context, the language, the Judeo-Christian ideas, etc. All right. The state of the field in 2012, put on there. It's very hard to see. In general, this is the editor of our book, tells us, keeps saying to us, that actually enrollments or sales of world history are they're still going up, but not as steeply. In other words, she has to convince us sooner or later it will make some money. Actually, it's another issue with publishing is in total crisis. This might also be something new to you. I don't think they do this in Japan. Definitely don't do it in Israel or Europe. Is that every student that's in my class is supposed to buy that book. So buying books is very expensive for a lot of students. It cuts into their budget for buying beer and other necessities of civilized life. All right, so let me end here quickly so that I can ask your questions and make your comments. First of all, history is in crisis. The humanities are having a hard time, and not just in the United States. I'm talking to Japanese colleagues who teach history and do Slavic culture, Russian literature. I'm talking to Israeli colleagues. I know Finland. Trying to get a job at the university is like, it's like trying to become the Pope, It's insane difficulty. I have enormous admiration for people that do this. Humanities are really are having a hard time. We're having to justify ourselves in a way that we didn't 40 years ago. I can't remember those good old days. But at the same time, history is integral, it's central for, in a strange way, both for conservatives and for liberals. In the United States, liberal means the left because there is no left. So that's as left as you get. So if you say to an American, if you say to a European liberal, it means conservative, or tends to be on the right or center right. Not for us. So because there aren't socialists, you can't call yourself a socialist in the U.S. It's impossible. Socialists, I say to my students, they think of people that are burning down buildings and they're blowing up airliners or something. We think of, if you think of socialists, you think of Mitterrand, these total bourgeois, not exactly scary people. But in any case, both sides in the United States use history in a pretty, I would say, kind of definitely dishonest, one-sided way. The conservatives, and I'd say this is not unusual. In different countries, they go back to 1890. This is 22 years after the Civil War, and so many changes have happened in Japan that the oligarchy is saying, whoa, we need education that is a little more conservative and that emphasizes traditional values, the emperor, Japanese past, etc. That conservatives are still doing this. I'm sure if you ask Mr. Romney, are you against history? Oh, God forbid, But then ask him what kind of history he wants taught. That's what's key. Or if you ask Mr. Obama, the exact same thing. Yes, I want students learning about that there were black people in the U.S., and that there was slavery, and that there was injustice. So these are things that won't go away, and I think that's what makes doing history and studying history, whether we're in Otaru or in Auckland, or even in Vasa, I'm not sure about Vasa. It's exciting and it won't change. So, arigatou gozaimasu, and I look forward to your questions.